An anti-abortion group has started 40 days of protests outside the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital in Glasgow. The 40 Days for Life group, which was founded in America, has held what it calls prayer vigils outside clinics in Glasgow, Edinburgh and Aberdeen since 2016.
Campaigners against the protests hope this will be the last time the group is able to take such action, as legislation is being considered that will aim to stop protests directly outside medical facilities by creating buffer zones. Now, the bill was introduced at Holyrood by Gillian Mackay, MSP, who's branded the protests as disgraceful. But the Catholic Church says the new rules would impact people's right to protest. Andrew Kerr has the story.
Beginning 40 days of what they call prayerful protest. This anti-abortion group holds their vigil at the start of Lent outside the Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Glasgow. There were counter-protest placards behind them. This is near the maternity unit. They say they save lives, but a new bill in the Scottish Parliament is designed to create a 200-metre buffer zone to stop protests getting too near clinics. The demonstrators didn't want to speak, but their representative believes this is an attack on free speech and denies that women are intimidated.
I would say we're not targeting people. This isn't a way to target people. And I believe it is important to go and pray where the place where abortion happens, because abortion doesn't happen in the Parliament. It doesn't happen in the law courts. It doesn't happen in schools and universities. It happens in the local community.
But outside the hospital in Wishaw, this Green MSP calls the protests utterly shameful and says the new bill that she's piloting through Parliament could make this the last year of demonstrations in close proximity to clinics.
My bill won't do anything to the right to protest. It just establishes those zones where it's not okay to do so. I strongly believe that there are much better places to protest if you want to change abortion laws, and those are almost certainly outside Parliament and not outside healthcare settings where people are just trying to go about their day and have their appointments.
Back at the hospital in Glasgow, the new health secretary was meeting staff, and he says the bill has cross-party support, including that of the Scottish Government.
We want to see it move through Parliament as quickly as possible. We're providing support to her to see that happen. Of course, we want to see a right to protest protected, but that cannot impede upon people, women, accessing medical services.
In England and Wales, there's concern that new laws on buffer zones could be watered down. In Scotland, this legislation could be law by the end of the year, but it could face a legal challenge from campaigners.
Andrew Kerr with that report. Well, we heard from Gillian Mackay there, and she joins us now on the sofa, as does Peter Kearney from the Scottish Catholic Media Office. Gillian, just tell us about these protests. Have there always been protests, and to what extent have they changed in nature over the years?
So there have been protests for quite some time now, and some of them have been quite markedly different in certain places over the past few years. We've seen outside Sandyford in particular, in Glasgow, quite loud protests with loud hailers and body cameras as well as the more typical protests outside of the likes of the Queen Elizabeth and other settings. We're concerned that there are the potential for tactics to increase in nature, and us to see more of what we've seen at Sandyford in particular, and that did cause particularly acute problems there.
I mean, it's interesting you say loud hailers. I mean, the campaigners will say, actually, these are peaceful vigils and they are prayers, essentially.
I think from the evidence of outside Sandyford, they're not all like that, and I think there's an underestimation of how intimidating and harassing a large group of people outside of a healthcare setting can be for people who are just going to access their right to healthcare. And that's why I believe that we need my bill to ensure that those safe access zones are in place to stop people feeling intimidated or harassed when they're going to their appointments.
Peter, would you accept that there's intimidation and harassment, as Gillian says?
You don't need to ask me that. Ask Police Scotland. They were quite clear in the consultation on Gillian's bill that there hasn't been any criminality. Now, the reality, and your viewers might be interested to know this, might even be surprised to know this, no one has ever been arrested outside an abortion facility in Scotland for intimidation, for harassment, for breach of the peace. As far as the Police Scotland are concerned, there is legislation that would allow them to deal with any criminality, but there isn't any. So what's happening here looks a bit like a sledgehammer being taken to crack an invisible nut. And what we need to think about is the concept behind this. The concept is saying, and frankly, I would say using the word protest or protesters is pushing the barrier a bit, particularly when we've seen protests over issues like Gaza, the war in Ukraine, and so on.
You're protesting in the sense that you're looking for change and you're looking to alter people's
People are
opinions.
expressing an opinion. For the most part, we're talking about pensioners praying peacefully on the pavement. So, there's nothing violent, there's nothing aggressive, there's nothing intimidatory. And as I say, that's not my opinion or the church's opinion. That's the clear evidence from Police Scotland.
But what about that, Gillian? Isn't that a point that actually the police already have powers if the protests get out of order, for example?
We've been really clear that we want to stop these from happening in the first place. The police have no powers to be able to stop these protests from happening in the first place. That's the purpose of the bill. It allows people to express their opinion in every other part of Scotland other than the 200 metres.
But Peter's point is actually under current legislation, under the current law, they're actually doing nothing wrong.
Under the current...
Well, yeah.
So we're hearing from women that they are experiencing intimidation and harassment. I believe those women, and we need to support those women and anybody else going to healthcare appointments. It's not good enough to sit back and wait for more people to be traumatised and harassed by these activities going on outside of hospitals. Police Scotland have been very constructive in working so far through my bill process, and I hope that they will continue to be as we go forward. And I'll put the women's of Scotland's safety at the forefront of what we're doing.
Peter, praying might not be against the law, but this isn't just ordinary praying, is it? This is praying in front of somebody, which surely, at the very least, is a form of judgment if it's not harassment.
The question is whether or not it's committing a crime, though, and that, I think, is a very slippery slope. And actually, it wouldn't just be that. Someone standing silently praying would be caught by this.
But it is in their faces, isn't it? And it does affect how people feel.
If you walk down any of the main streets in Scotland on a Saturday, you'll see people out campaigning, protesting, trying to influence you. You can walk past them. No one will stop you doing that. Where I would agree with Gillian is she's trying to stop something happening. If you round people up and put them in prison, you will stop things happening. But the law doesn't normally take that sort of preemptive approach. What it says is, if you do something wrong, then the police will step in and you might be arrested.
If you're praying for somebody, that is judgmental, isn't it?
Well, in that case, if you're concerned that someone's passing judgment by praying, surely you'd be concerned that they could sit at home and pray. Perhaps that should be banned as well.
But you wouldn't have, for example, in a church, people holding up placards. So why have it in an environment like this?
Well, to be frank, that's for the people who take part in those protests to justify. That's the way they want to do it. That's the way they want to express their opinion. We do have a tradition, though, and we have human rights, which are hard-won, that allow us to have freedom of expression, freedom of opinion, freedom of assembly, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion. And we go down a slippery slope if we say that will only be for some, but not for everyone.
But you seem to be distancing yourself to some extent, saying it's up to the protesters how they behave. But aren't they backed by the Catholic Church? I mean, you're involved in these protests to some extent.
The Catholic Church isn't involved in the protests. That's not to say that some of the people involved in them aren't themselves Catholics, but they're not officially organised by the Church. But it's for those people to do that and decide whether, that is the best way for them to make their point.
How do you feel being aligned to what is an American movement, a right-wing movement, that you don't have any control over? Do you feel slightly uneasy at all about the importation of these campaigning methods, which aren't in the tradition of the Scottish Catholic Church?
Well, number one, they're not officially organised by the Scottish Catholic Church. But number two, I don't think what has happened here comes close to what has happened in any of the United States and any of the sort of examples we've seen there. They don't. But this, as I say, the danger here is this idea of preemptively acting. Let's round up the usual suspects to make sure they don't do anything wrong. I would ask people, imagine if you were randomly arrested in the street because the police thought you might shoplift, or in your car because they thought you might speed. That's not how the law should work.
Gillian, you don't sound convinced. Are you fearful that this American influence, it could actually get worse and people could become even more intimidated? Is that what you're suggesting?
I think there's definitely a danger we could import those tactics from the US, which is why I think it's really important that before any more harm is done, that we take this step to ensure that for 200 metres around healthcare settings, this is what we're talking about. We're not talking about banning it in the whole of Scotland. You can go and hold these protests anywhere else you want to, other than where people are directly accessing their healthcare services.
Isn't that a point, Peter, that no one's actually stopping you from holding a vigil or a protest or whatever you want to call it? It's just at a certain distance.
bearing in mind that 80% of abortions now happen pharmaceutically, they're done as the pills through the post, then potentially pharmacies could also be categorised as abortion locations, as could GP surgeries. So we're not just talking about a few clinics and hospitals, potentially we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of different premises. And the point remains, though, if you take the issue aside here, whether it's abortion pro or against, and just ask, should people be stopped and prevented by law from expressing a valid, peaceful opinion? I think most people would say
just Gillian,
shouldn't.
is there a freedom of expression argument here, a freedom of religion? I mean, if people want to pray, no matter how intimidatory you might think it is, it's a slippery slope when you start banning people from taking part in religious activity.
We've seen from the bill that was brought forward in Northern Ireland that there is a balance to be struck between the rights of those accessing healthcare and those who are taking part in the protests themselves. And that's what we've sought to do the whole way through this bill process, because otherwise it won't survive the inevitable legal challenge that will see to it. That is very much the approach we've taken, and it is about balancing those rights to ensure that those who want to continue these protests can do so at a more appropriate distance.
Okay.
But for those who are accessing their healthcare, they're free to do so from that judgment and intimidation.
Okay, Gillian Mackay and Peter Kearney, both thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.